it's Dave, and I'm here with Logan Bonner, who is lead designer for Paizo for the Pathfinder game. And I'm really interested in hearing about Remastered. You know, I know what most of the public knows, which is that it was partially a way to adapt to unpredictability from WotC around the OGL and things like that. And also, just tell me if I'm wrong about this, to really just establish Pathfinder as its own IP. So
yeah, that's
with really things that are thought of as very characteristic of D&D.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we had already kind of built a whole lot more setting around the game since it started. It kind of started very based on 3.5 D&D, and the setting has grown so much and expanded so much that we already had a whole lot more to work with. Even if we kind of got rid of some things that are more D&D specific, like the Drow, like some other, peoples and places and spell names and that sort of thing.
For sure.
So that was kind of the inciting incident that made us decide we needed to do a remaster. But while we were there, we also, the game came out in 2019. So there had been enough years of feedback on things that people didn't like and wanted changed, or just things that we had noticed as we went through and kind of wanted to spice things up a little bit. So it was a rough place to start. Kind of a difficult situation to start out in, but we also recognized all the opportunities we had. So we really tuned up the game and kept it backwards compatible as much as we could while we were doing that. But really it was like, okay, this class could use a big revamp. These spells aren't really working great. We're going to swap them out. So it was an opportunity that kind of came out of difficulty, but we ran with it. So.
It seems similar to what WotC's doing with whatever they're calling 5.5, right? 2024, I think is the
50th anniversary edition.
Yeah, something. One of three names.
Reprint with a little spice.
Yeah, as far as tweaking the rules and things like that go. I did read through the remastered. I had never played a Red Second Edition, so I'm not going to be a great hand at comparing that. I played First Edition. But that's one thing I wanted to ask is, what were the other goals besides really separating the IP? And by the way, that makes a lot of sense to me because it's definitely true. Golarion is its own world. It doesn't feel like it's a Wizards of the Coast setting. It really feels like its own setting.
There were a lot of pieces, especially early on, like there was a Drow adventure path that heavily involved them, but they haven't been doing much in recent years. So they were fairly easy to not really talk about anymore. There are some other things like that where a lot of the D&D-esque or D&D derived specifically stuff had already kind of run its course, and we had new things we wanted to move on to anyway. So it was just good timing for that. As far as the other goals, there's that kind of rules tune-up. One of the other things we wanted to do is really amp up and improve the presentation. So one of the big things is we really put a lot of work into giving better book organization. It's easier to find things in the book. The playing the game chapter, the main rules part of Player Core, is really refined. And organized much better, easier to find things. That was a big focus. So one of the things I think people are going to notice if they've been playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition, especially if it's like a player who's never picked up a core rulebook, if they look at Player Core, they're going to get a much easier to reference book. And I think that's a really big improvement. Another one was monsters. We wanted to get kind of more monsters in Monster Core than we had in Bestiary to introduce some new concepts, revamp some old ones, kind of take some things that were really only hanging on by their fingernails from D&D tropes and kind of use the Pathfinder version. I think a good example there is ghouls, because they had kind of the ghoul fever and the paralysis and all that stuff from D&D ghouls, which is pretty much impossible to make them balanced for their level if they can do all those things. And, we took our best stab at it. But they didn't really reflect the ghouls in our setting. They were still very D&D based rules-wise. And now that we don't have to necessarily have that tether, we could change how they work and revamp them a lot. So now they have more of a society. There's a big ghoul society in the setting in Golarion. So we said okay, what does that mean for the ghouls? How does it change their look, their backstory and their statistics as well?
Cool. What kind of things did you remove or add to make the ghoul be better balanced for the level that it's at?
Well, they kind of had the paralysis and horrible disease and everything. It's just it's a lot to put onto a party at who are encountering them at first or second level. I don't really have the tools to cure those things or prevent those things. One of the good things we were able to do with the original version, because of how Pathfinder works, we have the the critical and regular success being a big deal, and the failure and critical failure being a big deal.
Right.
So we could kind of put some of those things behind only critical failure to make them less frequent.
Interesting.
But that was still just really hard to recover from the way they were structured.
Gotcha.
And they're one of the things where it's like, we felt like kind of the weight of the history of them when we were initially doing second edition meant that we couldn't change them as much as we would have liked to for balance reasons. And then with the remaster, we were able to make those changes.
Oh, because you're changing everything.
Yeah. Another good example is the original version had ability scores and ability modifiers, but ability scores didn't really do anything on their own.
Right.
And we're kind of just there because they were there. They were hand-me-downs from D&D. So we removed those and just have attribute now.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the kind of thing we're able to streamline.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about Remastered, actually, is the removal of the base ability score.
Yeah.
It's confusing, and as far as I can tell, historically, the only reason for it is to roll up random stats with 3d6.
Yeah.
And if you're bold enough to say, you know what, it's not an option,
Yeah,
it's gone.
There's always that thing, and I've worked on 4th edition D&D and on Pathfinder 1st edition, not at its onset, but throughout it, and then in 2nd edition. And when you had the ability scores, there's always this thing is like, how can I make these matter? Is there a way to use these? And it's very hard to use them. So usually it's kind of a fool's errand to try to use them.
I noticed one thing. I've been doing videos about D&D 5.5, and I noticed there was one thing that they added, and it's at level 20 or something, that uses the actual score.
Finally. Got there.
If you want to play D&D up to level 20, which is a whole other conversation that we're not here to talk to you about anyway. But yeah, rarely used, and when it is, it's pretty lackluster. And I think that's friendlier to new players too.
Yeah, that's one of the big reasons. The other one that's very confusing to new people is we changed spell level to spell rank, so that you don't have level and have to figure out what the difference is between those, especially if you're a new player. And honestly, like, that's very good for new players. You get it mixed up even as an experienced player. Somebody says level out of context.
What are we talking about?
Yeah, you don't know what they mean.
Yeah, for sure.
So that was another one that was really nice to just be like, finally, we don't have to stand on precedent. We can just change this.
Right. Yeah. Now that I think about it, those are kind of sacred cows. And as long as you have the opportunity to cut away, like this isn't.
Yeah, we did a fair amount of that.
This is not a forked branch of the D&D source code anymore.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's for programmers and IT people out there who might get that reference.
That was one of the big opportunities we had, and it was really nice to do that. And like I said, we were kind of maintaining as much backward compatibility as we could. So the biggest things that didn't work there were things like alignment, which this was another opportunity. It's like, let's get rid of that. We are tired of the conversations about it. We think it's kind of reductive for understanding a world and the characters in it. We want more opportunities for gray morality. And that's one of the things we removed. So there were a few things like that where it's like backwards compatibility takes a little bit of a hit. So, but there were things like ability scores where almost nothing gets ruined by removing that. You know, if you had a feat in a book that required a strength of 14 and now it requires strength +2, it's pretty much the same.
Right. Yeah. That's all it ever really did anyway, right? Any of those would be set at breakpoints where you bump into the new modifier generally. Yeah. That makes sense. Again, it really seems like a great opportunity to cut the ties with sacred cows, which, you know, that base ability stat is, even spell level kind of is. You're going to get, like, if it's actual D&D, you're probably worried, not you, but whoever publishes that is probably worried about the grognards. You can't do that. And Pathfinder's in a great spot of not having that problem. And I feel like it's been around long enough that you've got loyal players who aren't worried about those sacred cows.
And that's honestly one of the things we were not sure about when we did second edition, because Pathfinder first edition, a lot of its fan base, especially initially, was coming from D&D 3.5, and they wanted an extension of that.
And we didn't want fourth edition, honestly.
Exactly.
No offense that you worked on it, but that's why we migrated.
Different games for different folks, right?
When I say we, I mean a limited group, not all players. I mean the players that I was similar to.
Fair number of players, so when we got to that point of doing second edition, it was like, how much can we really change? Because we don't want to kind of, do the same thing, alienate people. But now we have a much better sense of what our fan base is and what it's grown into. I think that they were a lot more receptive to change than we expected them to be.
That's great.
And we found that out. over the years. And, a lot of new people came in also with second edition.
So that's great too. Yeah. I was going to ask you about that. If you've gotten any feedback on Remastered, it's been out, at least the player core has been out long enough that you may have gotten some feedback. Are people receiving it well?
Yeah, people are receiving it well. I think, we told people that it was going to be a relatively minor revision, that most of their old stuff was going to work. And I think most people have said they told us that, and that is actually what it is. I think people were really uncertain how much the changes were going to, throw a wrench in their games. And most people were pleasantly surprised that it was pretty compatible. A lot of the changes, like removing alignment, people were kind of already championing the bit for. So they were happy to see that happen. Obviously, not 100% of people, but we found most of the big changes were people were pretty happy with.
Good.
We also made a bunch of changes to the classes. The Player Core 2 comes out right now. So that's the one where we get to take some of the classes that really needed the biggest facelift and present those in that book. Because we took the initial set of classes, the first 16 classes that we put out in second edition, and split those between Player Core and Player Core 2. And that's essentially just have smaller books at a better price point so it's more affordable for people decision, because we had the giant core rulebook, and we got a lot of feedback on that as well. It's just like, this is heavy, this is expensive. People wanted something a little lighter, easier.
Yeah, if I remember right, the GM stuff was also in the second edition core.
Yeah, it was, but now that we've done a GM core, we took the Game Mastery Guide, which didn't have the base rules, but had a bunch of supplemental stuff. We combined that all into one. And I think that was one of the biggest surprises to me working on it, was how much nicer it was to have all that in one place.
Yeah.
Because we had a section in the core rulebook that talked about the basics of building encounters, how to structure encounters. But then Game Mastery Guide, rather, had all the extra explanation of how to do it. And having all those in one place is just so much nicer.
Yeah,
so much easier to reference. And especially if you're starting out as a GM, it's just way better to have all that context at once.
One big core makes sense as an experiment to me. I mean, there are advantages in the sense that as soon as this edition comes out, you can play it. You don't have to wait necessarily for the GM guide and have this staggered period. But on the other hand, I think I agree with you that it's better ultimately, at the end of the day, it's better for the GM to have everything under one cover. That's cool. So if I remember right, and I may not, because it's been a long time and I'm getting older, my memory's starting to not be so good. But I think that something that I'm also not sure I'm remembering about D&D correctly, but I think the idea that you sleep all night and no matter what happened to you, maybe you got a finger chopped off, you got a black eye, you've fallen twice unconscious, maybe you were in a coma for a good 10 or 15 minutes, you get a good night's rest. I'm having a little fun here. I know people like this about D&D. I happen not to, and I joke about it a lot on the channel. This is one thing I don't care for. Guess what? There's no black eye. You're fine. If you really go hardcore and you're one of these hard master dudes, why isn't the cut infected? You could die from that. That part I don't care about, but I do think it's funny but I noticed that is the case. Did that start in second edition in Pathfinder as well? I think that's in Pathfinder too, right?
Not exactly. So we are much freer in Pathfinder 2 than in Pathfinder First Edition with your healing, but you do have to do things in character to heal. So you will get some hit points back overnight. But not all. If you want to heal up between combats, or you really, you're really beaten up, you want to heal, you're going to need to use skills or spells to heal. What we did do was made it much easier to use the medicine skill to heal up relatively quickly. So if you spend 10 minutes, you can heal somebody up pretty well. And with the skill feats in the game, you can pretty quickly say, oh, well, I want to heal more than one person at a time. And you can go up against higher DCs to heal at a higher amount. So as your skill gets better, you're going to get better at healing people faster and easier. So it does take some amount of your time, but I think most people find that they can usually be up to full relatively quickly, but we did want to make sure there was an in-character way of doing it.
I see. Okay, so it's somewhere between the two then.
Somewhere between the two,
like a decent compromise,
And that's actually one where when we did the Pathfinder playtest for second edition, we had it being very generous, and people were like, that's a little too much. So that's something we scaled back. I think originally it was 10 minutes, you heal a bunch of people for a fair amount. And then we kind of said okay, well, we're going to make the base skill healing one person, and the skill feats are how you get better.
Makes sense. Yeah, I did misremember that, because I do remember reading there's a formula in second edition for the overnight rest It's not all your hit points back. There's some form
it's fairly straightforward.
Okay. So that my remembering wrong does cue up my greater question. Not great, but I think it's relevant anyway. I do feel that, and I don't think it's a bad thing at all, but I see in second edition taking some cues from where D&D went. Well, wait. I could be wrong because it's just a whiff, right? I suspect maybe, and there's nothing wrong with this. Second edition took some cues from where D&D went in its development without being like, it's still on its own branch. It's still Pathfinder, but certain things kind of follow what's going on in the RPG world. With Remastered, it feels like that went in a bolder direction to just carve out Pathfinder's going to be Pathfinder. Do I have the right impression there?
Somewhat. I think it's more, it kind of depends on which expansion you're talking about, because there's Stephen Redding McFarlane and I both worked on 4th edition and worked on Pathfinder 2nd edition. There are very few things where we said, oh, let's just grab this from 4th edition and port it over. But we certainly had enough experience with that, and we knew which things people liked about it that we could use those lessons.
You got to draw on your experience for sure. That makes sense.
And that's kind of the sort of thing where we found having, like, there's kind of a 10 minutes is how long most out of combat things take. Because we did find it helped having incremental things people could easily understand. And you could say, okay, what's everybody doing for their first 10 minutes? And every player could do something rather than like, well, my thing takes 2 minutes. Well, my thing takes 13 minutes, right? And, having that sort of structure. And then 5th edition, I think there was a fair amount of kind of like parallel development because we were not super closely monitoring 5th edition, kind of Pathfinder was mostly derived from like what we thought the game needed rather than kind of what 5th edition is doing.
For sure.
But there are definitely some things where we solve the same problems in similar ways. Or had like, I think we both called spell-like abilities innate spells because spell-like abilities is a terrible phrase. And
Agreed.
what else are you going to call it? Innate spells is exactly what they're. There's things like that. But most of it was parallel development. There wasn't much that we looked at 5th edition and said like, oh, let's do that exactly.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I mean, it's there's only so much you can do with the D20 fantasy game.
Yeah.
To counterpoint my own question, sometimes I think people push that too far. There are certain games coming out that I won't name because I'm not trying to bash them that I scratch my head and I'm like, you're trying to get so far from the way this has always worked that I don't know if it's good. Like you may have broken it accidentally by trying to be too different, That makes sense to me. And by the way, I don't mean to, I'm being playful about 4th edition. I don't mean to give it too much grief. I know like it's undergoing a renaissance of appreciation.
Yeah, it is.
Matt Colville leading that charge a little bit. And I do appreciate it better than I used to. I think I'm not smart enough for it sometimes. It's not exactly rules crunchy, but when it comes to, I'm a forever DM, so that's always my perspective. When it came to running monsters, I had to keep track of so much that other people are good at, that it gave a lot of nuance to the game. And I think other people had that problem, didn't really appreciate what it was doing at the time.
I think Pathfinder 2E does have some similarities there. There's a fair amount of like condition tracking, monsters having, a pretty significant suite of abilities. But it does have, it's informed by 4th edition, but it is not really strictly based on it. So a lot of the things like, encounter powers and daily powers, sometimes fans say like, oh, the focus spells are encounter powers. And they do kind of come from like a similar idea of wanting to have something that spellcasters can do that is not crossbow and it's not fireball, something in the middle, where they're kind of lacking that space. But they were kind of structured to be a little bit different. And in the remaster, they got a little bit easier to use, and so they kind of now feel a little more like encounter powers than they used to. But that was basically just based on fan feedback of like, why is this so complicated? We want something that's just a little simpler. And so we went with it. The simpler option is easier for people to understand and kind of what they were already asking for.
I like that. And my impression from the outside is that is the sweet spot Pathfinder's found. It's not an insanely crunchy game where you're going to tear your hair out in frustration, but it's also, if you're ready for some more nuance than D&D, this is something to look at.
Yeah, we're aiming for a very specific fan base. And we do want people who are in that spot where it's like D&D feels a little flat to them. But they don't necessarily want to roll on a hit location table every time they make a swing. Right. They want something in the middle. Yeah, that's. We think there's an important market there, and people are really going to enjoy that. So that's kind of who we aim for. We are always kind of mindful about how complex, especially Pathfinder First Edition got with some of its later options. So one of the tricky things is kind of like keeping it close to the complexity level we want, while still breaking new ground and trying out new things.
Yeah.
So that's always a bit of a challenge, and sometimes we have to rein ourselves in or rein freelancers in or say, this isn't going far enough, right? It's always kind of a balancing act.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if I wonder if that's unique to you. Again, I'm an industry outsider. I don't know, but that makes me think that's maybe a little bit unique to Paizo generally, and Pathfinder specifically. Is trying to get into that specific balance you're talking about.
Yeah, I think
it's very challenging.
Part of it is not necessarily unique, but there aren't that many games that have that large of a game line. And that's kind of the big difference is because we're putting out so many products that even companies that have an ongoing line that they keep putting out releases for, most companies are just much smaller. So even when they're doing that, the sheer quantity of products we do is just very vast for a big company compared to a lot of tabletop companies.
Which really, honestly, is another way of saying you have a broader appeal than more niche games, which goes back to that balance.
Right. We have enough of a fan base that we can support that many lines, which is really tricky to do.
Yeah.
But we have people who are really into the setting, have people who are really into the rules, have people who are really into the adventures. So a lot of it is just kind of like, how much of each spice do we put into each dish to keep those people happy?
Right. That's interesting. Well, Paizo's been doing it for a long time, so apparently doing a good job. Still got customers and plenty of people in this room were in happily playing Starfinder and Pathfinder at a minimum. I don't know what else they might be playing, but
I think this is mostly Pathfinder and Starfinder here. Yeah. We just launched the Starfinder playtest, so I suspect there are some tables of that going on out there too.
So we are at now with Remastered, we have the GM core, the player core, and what am I forgetting?
Monster
Core, yeah.
And then Player Core 2 just
came out. What else can we look forward to for Pathfinder going forward?
The kind of most recently announced book for the rulebook line is NPC Core, which is going to have a lot of non-monstery people to fight. Fight, befriend, romance, whatever you want to
gamble with.
Yeah, gamble with. Yeah, absolutely. So that's going to be a really fun book. We also have the fairly recent books, Hell of the Wild. We have War of Immortals coming up. The core line is kind of the more like meat and potatoes books, and then something like Hell of the Wild is going to let you play a centaur or an awakened animal. If you want to be a raccoon wizard or whatever, you can do that.
People are really into that now, I've noticed.
Well, that's one where it's like, you know what? There's a trend happening. Let's ride this one. We think we can do it in a cool way that is still going to be balanced and going to be fun for people at their tables. And, awakened animals have been in fantasy role-playing games and fantasy fiction for so long.
For as long as fantasy fiction's
let's do it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So that was really fun. War of Immortals is kind of both a big event and has a couple cool like mythic. It has some cool mythic rules for playing like over-the-top, folklore-based campaigns, and it also has 2 new classes that are really fun and exciting and kind of have big-time, weird, supernatural powers, which is always fun.
Like high-level stuff?
They can play at all levels, but they do have like some over-the-top, like if you want to do your like Hercules, Achilles kind of stunts, you're gonna want to look at the Exemplar, and then the Animist can kind of use spirits and kind of power within themselves for them.
I like that stuff. Wrestling with God type of stuff. Yeah, that's fun. Is there one title you're most excited about that's coming out?
Oh man, I mean, I think Player Core 2 was the big one.
It was? Okay.
Yeah. And that's kind of the one that I worked the most closely on of a bunch of those. Other members of the team were kind of taking the lead on War of Immortals and Howl of the Wild. So that was kind of my baby of the bunch. And it's got some big revamps to our Alchemist class, our Champion class, that I think are going to make those a lot more fun for people to play and get some excitement around those.
If you're at the con, you want to play Pathfinder, Starfinder, looks like there's pickup room at the tables, even if tickets are sold out. We are in the Sagamore Ballroom here where all this is happening.
Yep.
And there's product in the ballroom. There's also product in the merchandise, what do we call it? The exhibitors hall.
Yeah. Big old booth, front left corner.
Plenty of Paizo for your enjoyment. And if they're not at the con and they want to check out Paizo and Pathfinder and Starfinder, where do they go? What do they do?
They're going to go to paizo.com. That has, a bunch of blogs with behind the scenes stuff and new announcements. It's got our store, free stuff to download, all kinds of cool things. The other thing is if you're interested in Pathfinder and you're like, I don't know if I want to shell out the money for this, if you go to archivesofnethys.com, you can see all the rules for free, get a preview. I do recommend, if you're learning the game, having the book either in physical form or PDF is going to help you learn it a lot better. But if you're like, I don't know if I want to try this class or not, from a supplemental book, Archives of Nethys is a great place to get a preview and check it out.
That's been a fan favorite. I have read praise after praise about that because it's not just an SRD, it's everything.
It is everything.
The flavor and stuff.
Officially licensed agreement. Nope, they've got the flavor too.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
Okay.
They formerly, before the license, they were excluding. Well, I'm sorry, they were not able to monetize because they included the lore of the world. But now there's a licensing agreement with them, so they've just got everything.
Great. Cool. Anything else you want?
I think that's it for me.
Okay, I didn't mean to cut you off there. Sorry about that. Well, thank you so much for your time. It was great talking to you.
Thank you. Great to meet you. And play some Pathfinder.
Yeah, I play a little Pathfinder, and I'll even risk heresy and say that enjoy the 50th anniversary of D&D if you want to. Check out the 2024 books. But if you're skeptical about Wizards and you've only ever played D&D, there's never been a better time to try something like Pathfinder. Yeah, there's many things about it that are enjoyably different, but at the core, at the end of the day, you're rolling a d20, you're adding a modifier to hit a monster. It's going to be very familiar to you. Give it a try.
Yeah.
I don't think you shouldn't play D&D. If you're into that, go ahead, but now's a great time to explore all these wonderful options that are out there if you want to try out something else.
Yeah. And I'll add one thing there, which is we have a fabulous Pathfinder beginner box. Gorgeous box, has battle maps, has pawns, has dice, has pre-generated characters, and you can make your own. It's a great product. It's a really wonderful starter set. So
there's enough in the starter to create your own character too?
There is, yeah.
That's on you?
Just for the first 3 levels of play.
Sure.
But you can get a lot done in the first 3 levels of play. A bunch of monsters in there too to make your own adventures.
There you go. Pick up a starter box.
Yeah.